Hello, my name is Thomas and welcome to this edition of British Culture, Albion Never Dies. Today, K is for kings, knights and knaves. Some of these topics that I've covered have been really tough. I think I ended up being really difficult in terms of some of its, just more complex topics. J, I was overwhelmed with the numbers of suggestions. K, I feel like I can finally relax with this topic. But I say that. When I talked about J, one of the things I covered was Jaffa cakes, and I asked people, well, is Jaffa cake a cake or a biscuit? It's the great debate. So I asked people on Instagram, I asked people on Facebook, I asked just some close personal friends who gave me the benefit of their thoughts. On Instagram, it was 55% to 45% in favour of cakes. Quite a lot of people said Jaffa cakes are cakes. But it was interesting, quite a lot of people when they voted sent me a message saying, but not because it's in the name. They just felt it was a cake. On Facebook I asked people, and it was overwhelmingly in favour of biscuits. If I total together the total number of votes in favour of biscuits, well, together Instagram and Facebook votes combined, in a one-man, one-vote kind of a way, and that was 72 votes for biscuits, and that means biscuits is the winner, because it was only 30 people voted for cakes. So it seems that Jaffa cakes, despite the name, are in fact biscuits. And again, found it super interesting that even people who are in favour of Jaffa cakes being cakes were very quick to say, but not because it's in the name. Yeah, lots and lots of people. I'm not going to pick out any one person because there's so many people who messaged me, look, cakes go hard, biscuits go soft when they're out of date. And I think my favourite response to all that was from a lady on Facebook called Margaret, who said, our Jaffa cakes have never had a chance to be out of date. They always get eaten too fast. I really like that. And yeah, what are Jaffa cakes? For those who do not know, I have to admit, I was shaky on this. I didn't realise that Jaffa cake is not a brand name. Although McVitie's make kind of the most famous, the iconic Jaffa cakes. Jaffa cakes are a type of biscuit or cake. I mean, obviously I've just said how the vote went, but Mary Berry on the BBC Food website actually put out a recipe for Jaffa cakes, which pretty simple actually, pretty straightforward. It's comprised of 3 parts. The jelly. Of course, in the last episode we were saying how jelly is the British English for what Americans call jello. So the jelly, the sponge, and the chocolate topping. So again, just defining what they are. So when Mary Berry makes it, she adds orange zest to orange-flavoured jelly, or jello. And she makes a very simple sponge out of butter, egg, flour, and sugar. And the topping is just plain chocolates, and she said the only fiddly bit is making the chocolate look perfect, but they're still great if you just spoon it over. So yeah, you have the sponge underneath, the jelly on top, and then the chocolate on top of that. 3 simple parts. I must say a big thank you to Ian in Shenzhen, who sent me kind of the full legal rundown, because it is a legal debate whether they are a biscuit or a cake, and the reason is value added tax. So in the United Kingdom, VAT is payable on chocolate covered biscuits, but not on chocolate covered cakes. The VAT is determined by whether it's a luxury or a necessity. So McVitie's classified Jaffa cakes as cakes, but then in 1991 had to defend this categorisation in a VAT tribunal. Now I was looking at how much is this really worth. On the Tesco website, they currently say that McVitie's Jaffa cakes is £1 for a pack of 10, so it's 10p per Jaffa cake. And then BusinessInsider.com said that 2 billion Jaffa cakes are made each year in the Stockport factory. Now, I think BusinessInsider.com is an American website, so that gets into the question, what is a billion? So then I was going on to the website for the Campaign for Plain English. So the old UK meaning of a billion was 1 million million, or 1 followed by 12 noughts. Now, in the USA, the meaning of a billion is 1,000 million, so 1 followed by 9 noughts. That's a significant difference. But increasingly in the UK, we're using the USA meaning of a billion for these big numbers, and a trillion for the old UK million of 1 followed by 12 noughts. Now, the UK government has been using the American meaning of a billion since about 1974 for the numbers it gives out. So, 2 billion times 10p gives us 20 billion. Or 20 billion pence. So that's 2 billion pounds. 2 billion pounds times 0.20 gives us 400 million. So that's the current value of VAT on Jaffa cakes, assuming those 2 billion Jaffa cakes are sold within the UK. So it's a 400 million pound question. So I can see why people get exercised over whether Jaffa cakes are a biscuit or a cake. It's worth 400 million pounds. Now, when this was assessed at the VAT tribunal, Jaffa cakes were assessed using the following criteria. The product's name, which a lot of respondents said was irrelevant on both sides of the debate. The ingredients, texture when stale, which overwhelmingly is what most people said was the important thing. The structure, the size, how it's sold and how it's marketed. In Ireland, when they went through the same debate for the same reasons, they actually looked at the moisture content. So they're considered cakes because the moisture content is above 12%. And one gentleman messaged me and said, what about dunkability? You can dunk a biscuit in tea, and technically, of course, you can dunk a cake in tea if you want to, but nobody does. So it's dunkability. In conclusion, Jaffa cakes are biscuits according to the UK and Irish courts and the overwhelming majority of our listeners. And the question is worth a very, very great deal in terms of tax revenue. So, let's get to the main topic of this episode. I feel we've dealt with Jaffa cakes now. The main episode title is Kings and Queens. So Ryan Haggerty on Instagram, Christine on Facebook, King and Country, according to Michael_007 on Instagram, and Rockall2020, some gentlemen we might hear from later. King's Arms in terms of pub names, Kingdom, Bond Up North, and Eileen and Susan on Facebook. Kings was a very, very popular response. Knights, Daniel Gaster on Instagram, and you'll hear him on From Tailors with Love, and on Facebook. Bill, Kathy, Jenny, Teresa were all keen on knights, as well as knighthood, according to N. Slayton. You might want to check out his new YouTube channel, The Other Fellas. Knights of the Realm on Facebook, Linda. Knights of Old on Facebook, Martin. So that's interesting. We're really looking at the nobility in the United Kingdom. Knights, of course, is the origin of chivalry from the old French chevalier itself, from a Latin root, essentially meaning horseman. And again, I was just having a quick read online just to refresh my memory. At one point in our history, I think around the 11th century, it seemed to be that they were running around wild, and the kings sought to control them, giving them basically a code of conduct. And it's that code of conduct from which our current idea of a gentleman is largely derived. Now, I've mentioned before, I think on the H is for Henry's episode, that my school in Ipswich, founded, at least first recorded in 1399, I was actually taught about knights training as part of my school history, as that was really the origin. Traditionally, a young boy who was going to become a knight was sent to an uncle. I guess the uncle might be a little bit harsher than the father might be, push him a bit harder, and then there were institutes, schools being set up, again, to push boys who'd be trained from quite young. Again, just off the top of my head, I can remember boys around the age of 8, first of all being trained to ride a horse with metal shoes, right? So the full suit of armour, it takes a lot of getting used to. So they're being trained, I say, from a very, very young age. Obviously, if they're riding around with a sword and a shield, you have to control the horse through your legs. So first of all, you had these great heavy shoes, they're riding around, and if you go to Leeds Royal Armouries, you can see these child-size suits of armour, which are really just for training. Very, very heavy, and gradually more and more bits of the armour would be put on as they went towards their teenage years. I remember it was about 13 that they're being given armoured gloves. If you read Roger Moore's 00 diaries, he's talking about Live and Let Die. He refers back to when he was filming Ivanhoe. Of course, he was wearing Hollywood armour, which, you know, may have looked right, but didn't it didn't flex right, so he actually had a lot of problems controlling horses. He was a very skilled horseman, I understand, but was having a lot of trouble in what is essentially very hard tinfoil outfit. Slightly more sophisticated back in the day, but again, boys have been trained from when they're very, very young, first with the shoes, with the gloves, more leg armour, and so on. It built and built, but part of their schooling was also the code of conduct for a knight. And of course we tend to think of, it was Ian and Shenzhen again who talked to me about King Arthur and his knights. So we've got a couple of Ks there, the K for king and the K for knights. Where do we get this idea for King Arthur from? I definitely have a very strong image in my head of King Arthur from T.H. White's 1958 book, The Once and Future King. Again, looking into this, I realised it was collecting together and then expanding some works he'd written in kind of 1938 to 40. Now, the first part is called The Sword and the Stone, and that was very, 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 very loosely adapted by Disney in 1963. And according to the Diz Insider website, there's a live-action remake in development. It might be a long time before we see it. It'd be wonderful. I wonder if we would have this as closer to the book, because I have a very strong affection for the book. White based his work on Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory, way back in 1485, still more recent than my school. I have attempted to read through it. I think I've read the first half of it. To be honest, I found it less readable, but I found it helped greatly by reading T.H. White, and it's interesting that some things that are covered in detail by Thomas Malory, T.H. White kind of avoids and tells the other half of the story, so you can read them side by side. Of course, if you want a ripping good yarn, an over-the-top retelling of the story, there is 1981's Excalibur, which is based on Le Morte d'Arthur as well, combining a couple of characters and simplifying it. But if you really, really, really want some fun, just a few nights ago I rewatched Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail, the 1975 film, co-directed Terry Gilliam and Terry Jones. And Terry Jones, of course, had studied English literature at Oxford University and was a serious historian. So he wrote in 1980, just 5 years afterwards, Chaucer's Knight, the portrait of a medieval mercenary, in which he's reassessing some of the characters in Chaucer's writings. And he also co-wrote Who Murdered Chaucer as recently as 2003, where he argued that Chaucer was close to King Richard II, that after Richard was disposed, Chaucer was persecuted to death. So again, he's a serious historian, so it's funny, when you watch Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail, some of the most surreal and peculiar details are in fact very, very historically accurate, from the monks hitting themselves over the head to the castle that catapults a cow at the people besieging it. Of course, I had that greatly detailed in the Crusades, because of course if you have a sick animal and it dies, you don't want it hanging around in your castle when you're being besieged, so catapulting it out was an early form of biological warfare. Give a sick animal to the other side. And then of course there's knaves, so we talked about kings, the highest, knights, kind of lower down, and then knaves. In cards, some people call a jack a knave, but in the context of a royal household, it meant a male servant with no specific role and no specific skill. So he's not a cook, he's not a gardener, he's not a coachman, he's just a boy. It did become a derogatory word, because the royal household had so many of these young men who, reading online, they went swaggering about in the streets, picking fights, molesting girls, and generally making nuisances of themselves. And later on in our language, we refer to them as jacks, in the 16th and 17th centuries, to mean kind of generic fellows, as in jack of all trades, master of none. So I guess in modern day we call them jacks instead of knaves. And any time I read that word, I have to say I go to the 15th century poem. You've probably heard this. It's at the beginning of the novel Kes. An eagle for an emperor, a griffalcon for a king, a peregrine for a prince, a saker for a knight, a merlin for a lady, a goshawk for a yeoman, a sparrowhawk for a priest, a musket for a holy water clerk, a kestrel for a knave. Nobody actually suggested K is for Kes, which surprises me. Sometimes I've got my own little list of things that I'm anticipating, and maybe much later in the series I'll start going through that just to shed some light on my own thinking, because I'm often quite surprised by a lot of the answers that come forward. I was kind of expecting Kes for this, but, well, I'll hold that thought. For now, I really want to get into the suggestions that I was given, because they were just so good. Michael J. Fook emailed me to say K is for Kipling. Not just those who make exceedingly good cakes, but of course Rudyard Kipling, the British writer, one of the great Anglo-Indians I mentioned in I, which ultimately, again, voting seemed to be eyes for imperialism, both from Brits and non-Brits who are listening. But of course, Kipling wrote such wonderful things as The Jungle Book in 1894, which of course got adapted to The Jungle Book by Disney, which has surprisingly little to do with the book. There are connections, of course. Kim, which I'd love to see a good movie version of this. Kim from 1901, and many short stories like The Man Who Would Be King, which was adapted to a great film with Sean Connery and Michael Caine. And of course he wrote a number of poems, such as Gunga Din, Mandalay, The White Man's Burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands. And of course, in 1910 he wrote the poem If. He's a very interesting man, and I think looking at his life gives a great kind of window into, well, the world at the time. He was born in India, of course, spent his first 5 years there until he was sent to live with a strange family in the UK at the age of 5. He had no relatives there, so he was sent there to give him some decent education, and returned 6 years later to India. And I may have read this quote before, but to be honest, if this is the second, third or fourth time, then I have to say, don't worry, there will be a fifth, because I find this gripping. He said, "I found myself at Bombay, where I was born, moving among sights and smells that made me deliver in the vernacular sentences whose meaning I knew not. Other Indian boys have told me how the same thing happened to them." I just find it gripping how he obviously had learned the local languages when he was under 5, and it remained in his subconscious, and as soon as he returned to that environment, it flowed. And I've studied a few languages. Turkish is my strongest second language, and I do find I go back to Turkey and I find I'm able to happily natter away. I know that a few years ago I went back having really, I try and study Turkish as much as I can, but my job had been kept me quite busy that year before. I hadn't had much chance, but certainly I found myself there discussing some of the intricacies of medieval architecture, which if I'd been asked, the week before, how do you talk about medieval architecture in Turkish, I'd have had no clue. But it is funny, you go back to the place and suddenly it floods back. Of course, my grandfather was born in British India as well. But again, it's my own experience in Turkey that really makes me think of this. I read his book, Kim. I read it when I was a child, I read it as a teenager. I've gone back to this many times. It's about a young British boy in India, and he learns various languages. He gets involved in all kinds of interesting plots in the Great Game, the battle in Central Asia between the British Empire and the Russians expanding to the same location. And one of the odd little lines is when it talks about Kim falling asleep and dreaming in one of the local languages in India, and it's something that makes him kind of puzzle when he wakes up of what is he and what is his native language and so on. And it really stayed with me, this kind of dreaming in a second language. And so for years I studied Turkish, and it just I found it interesting. I never really dreamed in Turkish until, well, what can I say? One day I woke up, I'd been having a long conversation in Turkish, and I said something, and my waking mind had no idea what it was. But I kept a dictionary by my bed. I grabbed it, looked it up, and I'd used it correctly. It obviously was in my subconscious. It was obviously right. But again, it made me think of Kim. There's something in the subconscious that it all rolls around in. But as I say, this writing on India seems to be less and less popular now. I love it. But it's his poetry that people look to a great deal now, and the most famous poem is doubtless If. So, here it is. If you can keep your head when all around you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or be lied about, and don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise. If you can dream, and not make dreams your master, if you can think, and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster, and treat those two impostors just the same. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make traps for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop, and build 'em up with worn-out tools. If you can make one heap of all your winnings, and risk it all on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose, and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth, and everything in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. If, by Rudyard Kipling. Say one of the most popular poems, and certainly one of my favourites. Keeping with a very similar era, but a very different topic. On Instagram, Your Best Bond messaged me and said K is for Kanga. I'm assuming here that this is Kanga for Winnie the Pooh. A. Milne served in both World Wars, joining the British Army in World War One, and was a captain of the British Home Guard in World War Two, and of course is slightly better known for writing the books Winnie the Pooh, which of course he wrote for his son Christopher Robin. I always find it interesting to look at the cast of characters. Of course they're just the toys that his son had, and it's an interesting insight into the time. We have Kanga and Roo, which of course kangaroo, because Australia's part of the British Empire. You have Tigger, the tiger, of course representing India, and then you have the English countryside animals, a donkey, pig, owl or rabbit, although of course the Cyprus donkey played an important part in World War One. And then you have Pooh, the bear, I guess, for North America. Heffalumps are talked about but never seen. I guess they're elephants from Africa or India. And it's interesting, I mean, these were the toys of Christopher Robin, the real life Christopher Robin, who in fact served in World War II, was wounded as a platoon commander in Italy, and after the war completed his degree in English literature at Cambridge. So I feel we're seeing a window into a different world here. Christopher Robin, of course, donated the animals, the original toys, to the book's editor, who has later on given them to New York Public Library, so you can go and see these animals, which again I find very interesting. They're kind of a little window into the England of the time. Christopher Robin disliked the idea of Winnie the Pooh being commercialised. I know it's now owned by Disney, but maybe there's more on this for the W episode. But it's too good not to mention this. As I say, these are all the different animals. I say you've got some from the British Empire and some which are just the English countryside animals. On a very different tone, not so Bond, Jeff.5887, and on Facebook Angela and Janet said K is for knickers. The punchline to many jokes of stand-up comedians of I'd say yesteryear. It's not so common as a thing now. And on Janet was saying knickers from Marks and Spencer's, of course. Lol. Ooh, this nearly won it. Kippers, Jerry on Instagram, and from Tales of Love. I think a few other people, I hope my notes are complete, but quite a few people said K is for kippers. I have to admit, I'm not one for kippers myself, so I had to look this up a bit just to check what exactly is a kipper. It's a whole herring, a small oily fish that's been split in a butterfly fashion from head to tail along the dorsal ridge, gutted, salted or pickled, and cold smoked over smouldering wood chips, typically oak. So yes, in Britain, Ireland, and some regions of North America, kippers are most commonly consumed for breakfast. In Great Britain, kippers, along with other preserved smoked or salted fish such as bloater or buckling, were once commonly enjoyed as a high tea or supper treat, most popularly inland and with urban working-class populations before World War II. I wondered about that. This is something I've read, as you may be able to tell. I feel it wasn't just working class. Well, I wonder if this is a fashion that started with the working class and slowly went its way up. Most fashions, when we talked about them, I talked about them with Kane, like gentlemen's wardrobes, started with the aristocracy and slowly filtered down. There were a couple of things that did start kind of lower down on the social scale and slowly filtered up, and I'm wondering if actually Kippers is one that started lower down and slowly filtered up, because a lot of people enjoy them. It does seem to be just a way of, you preserve fish by rubbing them with salt and spices and so on, and then smoke them, so it does seem, natural that this would be a way of consuming fish inland. But yeah, that nearly won it. There were 2 votes for the Kinks, from Spies and Ties, and on Facebook from Donna. So yeah, I believe it was Spies and Ties who messaged me, the most British of bands, the Kinks. I've mentioned before, I'm very, very, very careful about copyright. It might be okay to play a piece now, but who knows, in a year's time, suddenly I get something taken down. I've had that before, so I'm not going to risk it. But if you're listening to this, then you must have some method of listening to the Kinks. 1964's You Really Got Me is one of their biggest hits, and I have to say, that's probably my favourite from the Kinks. One lady messaged me and said, what about K is for Kane, as in Harry Kane? So Harry Edward Kane, MBE, is an English footballer who plays for Tottenham Hotspur and captains the English national team. He's regarded as one of the best strikers in the world, and if you're wondering what MBE stands for, it stands for the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. So again, we're looking at K is for knighthood. It's an order of chivalry, awarded to those who've made great contributions to the arts and the sciences. One gentleman on Instagram, Commander Robert Billick, messaged me K is for Kilgore. Again, I just had a little wander around the internet, and I found that this is a very, very common Scottish name, originating from the Pictish clans. The Kilgore family lived in Kilgore, fun enough, which is located near Falkland in the country of Fife. Sorry, the county of Fife, the ancient name of a parish in Fifeshire, Scotland, so called from a kill, a church, and gore, a hill, the church on a hill or surrounded by hills. So, okay. Well, I looked into this a bit more, tried to find maybe some famous Kilgores, and what we're really looking at is families now in America, Virginia, Massachusetts, San Francisco, who originated from this place. So it seems that Kilgores haven't made the biggest impact on British history. Maybe I'm missing something, but it seems that they've found their greatness elsewhere. But sticking with the theme of Scotland, Eileen, Farhan, Erica messaged me that K is for kilts, and I'm always very happy if I can include something that's not just from England in this podcast. Kilts are interesting, and to my mind, what I envisage as a kilt seems to be surprisingly recent. So it's first recorded in the 16th century as the great kilt, a full-length garment. The upper half is worn as a cloak, but what you think of as a kilt now is the small kilt, which emerged in the 18th century, and is essentially just the bottom half of the kilt. It's half a kilt. And then from the 19th century, it became associated with like the wider culture of Scotland, and then more broadly with Gaelic or Celtic heritage. If I see a kilt, I expect it to be in tartan. It can sometimes look a little funny if it's not in tartan. Again, tartan is another symbol of Scotland, but it's again surprisingly recent. It was kind of popularised after King George IV wore a tartan kilt on his 1822 visit to Scotland. Until the middle of the 19th century, the Highland tartans were only associated with regions or districts. So again, this idea of ancient clans having their own individual tartan seems to be a Victorian invention. It was the Victorians' penchant for ordered taxonomy and new chemical dyes. That meant the idea of a specific pattern of bright colours for specific groups. The Victorians liked their classifications, which makes sense. It was a time of enormous change, social change, technological change, sociological change. Everything was changing, and they're desperate to record what is it and what went before and what's coming. So it's interesting. It makes sense that a household, if one family was making kilts, it makes sense that they would have their family kilt, their family tartan, their own family ways of doing it. But again, a lot of what we see is a very rigid system of tartan kilts. It seems surprisingly recent. And gosh, they're expensive. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who's gone into a kilt shop and been desperately surprised by how expensive they are. Anyway, there's Scotland. I'm going to run through a few place names. Again, Not So Bond messaged me with another suggestion, which was Knightsbridge. Knightsbridge is an area of London. I was trying just to look for anything that stood out to me as notable or unusual. I'm not very familiar with London, so my fun fact for Knightsbridge was that from between 1885 and 1887, as a result of trade opening up between Britain and the Far East, Humphreys Hall in Knightsbridge hosted a special exhibition of Japanese culture in a setting to resemble a traditional Japanese village. The exhibition was wildly popular, with 250,000 visitors in its early months. So Japanese artisans illustrated their manners, customs, their art industries. They were dressed in their traditional kind of costumes. They had a magnificently decorated Buddhist temple and 5 o'clock tea. They demonstrated their tea ceremony, and they demonstrated their music as well. Just talk about life in Japan. And W.S. Gilbert and his wife attended the exhibition, which is said to have inspired him to write The Mikado. And when the Mikado requests of Cuckoo the address of his son, Nanki Poo, he's told that Nanki Poo has gone to Knightsbridge. So he even referenced it in his own musical. I thought that was a kind of a funny little fact about Knightsbridge. Deirdre suggested Killingworth, KS for Killingworth, which is in North Tyneside, England, again to the north of Newcastle, which was used as the filming location in the BBC sitcom Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. A fun old sitcom. Anyway, then there's Kingston upon Thames. Again, I'm trying to look for what were the most unusual things about these places. In Kingston upon Thames, there's the art installation Out of Order by David Match. I don't know how to pronounce his name, M-A-C-H. It's a sculpture in the form of 12 disused red telephone boxes, all tipped up, and they lean against each other like dominoes that have fallen down. I've seen this as a piece of modern art. I was surprised how old it is, actually. 1988, I thought it was more recent. Described by its creators anti-minimalist. It's just a fun site. On Facebook, Mike suggested K is for Kensington, home of Princess Diana before she died in 1987. Bond up north, good suggestion. Kingston upon Hull, which is where my naval unit used to be based. Lots of fun going out from there. Something that would always strike me going in were all the white telephone boxes, because of course the red telephone box is so iconic. It's such a symbol of Britain and Britishness. Hull's telephone network was never run by the British Post Office, which was responsible for the red boxes. In 1904, Hull City Council was one of several local authorities to set up their own phone network, and back then it was called Hull Telephone Department. Today it's KCOM, and it had cream phone boxes. They kind of look white to me rather than cream, but anyway. Other authorities later gave up their control of the networks to the Post Office, and the Post Office network was then taken over by BT, so all the telephone boxes in Britain that I've ever seen were red, except for Hull, which remained separate. They remained cream. So they were run by the City Council until they saw their final stake in 2007. But again, there's still, as it's a feature of the city, all these white telephone boxes. It does feel strangely like you've arrived in a foreign country, maybe like an alternative universe. Keep walking around expecting Doctor Who. Anyway, I looked into this again, this time from a BBC article. The BBC article is called 3 Puzzling Sites in English Cities Explained, written way back in February 2018. And again, it was 3, so I couldn't resist. One of the other ones was about a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Manchester, and someone had walked past it and asked, why do we have this? And it's because during the American Civil War, the city of Manchester boycotted cotton picked in the southern states in a protest against slave labour, which resulted in the Lancashire cotton famine, with mass unemployment and poverty among textile workers. But they put their principles ahead of their need to feed their families, and their actions assisted Lincoln in ending the Civil War in America. And Lincoln wrote a letter praising the working people of Manchester for their sublime Christian heroism. So a statue was put up in 1919, and asking a local historian, he said, I'd always assumed that Manchester history with the American cotton industry and slavery would be more negative. One of the things I love about Manchester is how much civic pride everyone has. So, again, just a local oddity. That's nothing to do with the letter K, but I just thought that was really, really interesting. It came up in the same article as the Kingston upon Hull white telephone boxes. Okay, I'm just going through again a few of the The final suggestions, K is for Kidderminster. According to Debs on Facebook, Kidderminster is a small town in Worcestershire. Notable people who were born there include Sir Rowland Hill, the inventor of the penny black and the modern postal system. There's a statue there in Vicar Street outside the town hall, and there's a pub named after him, which is always good. I'd love to have a pub named after me one day. I don't know how you go about that. One of the more unusual things is that Kidderminster is the home, the birthplace of the 27th Prime Minister of New Zealand, the last Prime Minister of New Zealand to be born outside the country. Walter Nash was born in Kidderminster and then moved to New Zealand when he was about 27. So again, insight into a different world. He was Prime Minister of New Zealand between 1957 and 1960. So I have to ask, if you are listening and you're in New Zealand, have you heard of Walter Nash? What do you think of him? Does he do Kidderminster proud? Oof. There was a lot to look into for this one. It's a slightly unfamiliar place to me. K is for Kent. It was Chris on Facebook who suggested this. Apparently referred to as the Garden of England. I feel it's the Garden of London, personally. But one of the interesting things I found was looking into who was from there, who's born there. Peter Cushing, of course, the actor famous for his Hammer horror films as Dr. Frankenstein, or alternatively as Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars. Peter Cushing was born in Kent, as was Tom Baker of Doctor Who fame, Jack Dee, the comedian who recently hosted Have I Got News For You, Bond girl Gemma Arterton from Quantum of Solace, J.M.W. Turner, who once painted a bloody big ship as it was described in Skyfall, Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer, who used to be on the £5 note, and Kenneth Clark, who did the TV series Civilization in 1969, and his book, published in the same year, has never been out of print since. There's one fella called Geoffrey Chaucer. Not quite sure what he did. On Facebook, Geraldine messaged me King's College. So I had a quick Google. King's College where? And there's King's College London, established in 1829 by King George IV and Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. Of course, he was Anglo-Irish, which I covered briefly in I is for Imperialism. Then there's King's College Cambridge, founded by Henry VI in 1441, who I covered in H is for Henry. There is King's College Oxford, that's an international language centre, a much more recent institution, about a 10-minute drive outside of Oxford. And actually there's a fair few King's Colleges in the USA, both in California and on the eastern seaboard, so it's a popular name. One that just spoke to me personally, Phil, on Instagram, messaged me, K is for Quina Lillet, which of course is French, but I'm going to include this because it speaks to me. It's a French aperitif, but it's used in the famous Vesper cocktail created by Ian Fleming in the 1953 novel Casino Royale. That cocktail is 3 measures of Gordon's, 1 of vodka, and half a measure of Quina Lillet. Now, from 1986, Lillet Blanc was commonly used in a Vesper. Since Quina Lillet had been discontinued, it was made from 1887 until that year, 1986, then replaced by Lillet Blanc. By the way, the quina in the name is derived from one of the main ingredients, which is the quinine, the bark of a quina or cinchona tree. I'm going to get messages about how I pronounce that. Anyway, I've taught how to make Vespers at events in China. It was great fun. I taught cocktail making. I think maybe the first time I actually made a proper Vesper was when I was showing people how to do it. It seems straightforward from the instructions. And they were served at my wedding. Of course, in a wedding, when you are the groom, you are quite busy. So I was served a Vesper and I was able to take a few sips, and then I was dragged away to do some other things, and then that Vesper was lost, so I just ordered another Vesper. I managed to get one, have a few sips, and I was dragged away for other things. You know, getting married, it's a busy day. So I probably managed to have a Vesper, full Vesper, maybe a Vesper and a half, I'm not sure. But goodness knows, I kept having to order them, take a few sips, and then there were a few things to do. Anyway, best day of my life. I think the final suggestion that I go into, and I messaged the lady again on Facebook, Nora, saying that this is a great topic, and probably, I keep saying this, I've tried to reserve this until now, this is probably one for a deep dive, because I really like this, and this is my recommended rabbit hole for this episode. It's Khartoum, Kandahar, and khaki. There's so many different approaches you can have to this. I'm probably going to have to take some time to really think about this. Khartoum, of course, is in Sudan, and its role in British history is really interesting, because this is where you get Gordon of Khartoum, who was sent down kind of to help the retreat of the Egyptian army, but who saw how the Mad Mahdi, who was referred to, the Islamic extremist of the 19th century, and decided to stay and fight until he was relieved. Of course, I'm not going to spoil your rabbit hole there. I really recommend you look into it, and of course you can look at his extraordinary actions during the Crimean War, where he distinguished himself outside Sevastopol. You can look at his history in China, because sometimes he's known as Chinese Gordon, for his actions during the Taiping Rebellion. And then it leads on, this war led on to another war in which Horatio Kitchener, you've probably seen the posters, Your Country Needs You. The American one has Uncle Sam. It was based on one that was originally done in the UK, which has Kitchener. He was already a hero for so many young boys growing up in the First World War. That was the big recruitment drive. It was Kitchener saying, Your Country Needs You. He was born in County Kerry in Ireland, so again, another great example of an Anglo-Irishman, and educated in Switzerland, and then at the Royal Military Academy, Woolwich. But he also fought in Khartoum. And again, so here you have two great figures of the time. For Kandahar, I'm actually reading a book right now called The Great Game by Peter Hopkirk. I referred to that earlier with the book Kim. So it's not the battles for Central Asia, which is not just military campaigns, although of course there were military campaigns. Family was involved in them. There is indeed a Colonel Crichton in the Rudyard Kipling books. Anyway, it's very interesting, the book by Peter Hopkirk, but it's also to do with diplomacy, it's to do with exploration, because a lot of Central Asia was completely unmapped and unknown to anybody. Of course, those who lived there might know, but they weren't telling anybody what was going on. They'd frequently simply kill outsiders, and outsiders were not allowed within city walls. You'd have to camp outside. It was very dangerous. There were many Russians who were enslaved by people in Central Asia, and again, Peter Hopkirk's book goes into this. There was one British explorer who might disguise himself as a pilgrim. He was actually searching, one of the fellas I was reading about was actually a vet searching for superior horses to breed on behalf of the East India Company, just to put it in a time frame, and was in a small mountain village and saw two kind of dogs of a European breed, and kind of went up to them and they started begging and doing some kind of a dog's imitation of a military drill, and he was asking the locals about them, if there are other Englishmen there. They said no, and he slowly realised from their secrecy that the Russians had already come there on their secret missions. The Great Game is a fabulous read. Khartoum, Kandahar and khaki. So khaki I talked about in the deep dive into British men's wardrobe, so you can refer back to that. And if you want a really interesting kind of rabbit hole, you can look into the connection between Sherlock Holmes and these things. In The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, Watson is revealed to have a framed portrait of Charles Gordon on his wall. And in fact, if you Google, I think it's General Gordon, Sherlock Holmes, you already get on the first page some really interesting, kind of free-to-read essays on Sherlock Holmes, Sudan, British Imperial Adventures, and all kinds of interesting little details. But again, what can I say? There's so much to this topic that I recommend to you, this rabbit hole. Message me if you do go on this rabbit hole. And as I say, this is something that I see as a very pregnant topic. It's something to cover later. So I am at the end. This was K as for kings, knights and knaves. I didn't go into kings too much. We have so many of them. I've already covered 8, almost 9 of them with the Henry episode. They dominate our history, and I'm not a historian. I'm very curious to know what angle I can approach this from. As I say, I'm reading this, I'm looking into this. I've not been to the UK for years. I've certainly not lived there for many years. But I'm fascinated to go on these deep dives into what is Britishness and what does Britishness mean to us. Right, I'm going to go. It's time for dinner. Thank you very much for listening, and if anything in this intrigued you, if you have corrections, I haven't received a correction for a little while. Maybe my research is better, or maybe people have given up on me. If there is a correction, please do message me. If you have something that you'd like me to cover more, please do. I keep saying I'm going to look into this later and so on, and I am looking at a few. As I say, this Khartoum and Kandahar and Kharkiv one, that's getting me going. I'm very, very interested in this. But again, just keep messaging me, because I'm going to get back to you. I'm going to respond. I couldn't make this podcast without so many fantastic suggestions. And this week I've certainly learned a lot about Jaffa cakes. Goodbye.